Gone are the days of gold rushes and stagecoach robberies. However, not all of that gold is lost to the pages of history. In fact, there is some treasure from the past that's still up for grabs. From lost gold-filled mines to buried gold left by fleeing outlaws. There's many stories of treasure from the Wild West. After years of speculation based mostly upon word of mouth from 100 plus years ago, these are some of the most credible legends I could find. The first story is about buried gold left by Richard H. Barter, or as he's better known as Rattlesnake Dick. He was an infamous outlaw during the gold rush. He and his gang robbed a mule train carrying $80,000 worth of gold bullion in 1856, and half of it remains buried somewhere in California. Half was recovered and used as a bargaining chip to get reduced sentences by arrested gang members. The other $40,000 remains buried after the gang went to find it after the robbery, but couldn't. That's well over $2 million when adjusted for inflation. Richard Barter wasn't always an aspiring outlaw. In fact, in 1851, Richard Barter traveled the Oregon Trail to California in an attempt to capitalize on the riches promised by the gold rush. He settled in a mining camp on the North Fork American River called Rattlesnake Bar. The area had been rich with gold early in the gold rush, but was starting to become depleted. Struggling to find any measurable amount of gold, Barter resorted to working for other miners with land claims. Barter was so determined to make a fortune from the area around Rattlesnake Bar, other miners started calling him Rattlesnake Dick. Little did they know, this name would stick and be remembered throughout history as a famous outlaw. It wasn't until 1853 when he had his first run-in with the law. He was accused of stealing from a dry goods store near Rattlesnake Bar. He was found to be innocent, and the town folk generally agreed that Barter was innocent. Later the same year, a lawman accused Barter of stealing a horse. Although Barter was insistent that he was innocent, he was found guilty and sentenced to 2 years in prison. Before he could be transferred to prison from the local jail, the real horse thief and horse were found, proving his innocence. But it didn't do much good. He had already gotten a reputation as a thief from the locals, and he was forced to move away from Rattlesnake Bar. He changed his name to Dick Woods and moved 200 miles to Shasta County to look for gold in the local rivers. This new life didn't last for long, however. Dick ran into a man who recognized him from Rattlesnake Bar. This led to others from Rattlesnake Bar traveling to Shasta County to inform the locals about Dick's reputation as a thief. Barter was once again forced to uproot his life. This time it was different, and this is where the story starts to take a turn. Barter traveled south and set up camp in the Red Bluff area, where it seems he decided if he was going to have a bad reputation, he was going to earn it. Barter robbed someone and told the man that his name was Rattlesnake Dick. Over the next few years, he went on to gain a reputation for stealing cattle, horses, gold from miners, and just cold hard cash. Finally, he deserved the bad reputation that seemingly followed him around. He was far from done, though. Barter formed a gang with 5 other men: George Skinner, Cyrus Skinner, Big Dolph Newton, Romero, and Bill Carter. It was this gang that would rob the Wells Fargo Express mule train of $80,000 worth of gold. Barter and Cyrus left the gang to go get fresh mules to carry the weight of all the gold. The rest of the gang was able to hold up the mules and steal the gold without bloodshed. The 4 men took the Wells Fargo mules and hauled the gold to meet Barter and Cyrus, but they weren't there at the place they said they'd meet. The gang searched the nearby area to look for the other men and the new mules, knowing they couldn't risk anyone seeing the mules branded with WF for Wells Fargo. They waited for Barter and Cyrus to show up for 3 days. George decided to bury half the gold so they could haul the other half away with the tired mules. They traveled to Folsom and stashed the remaining gold. When trying to figure out what happened to Barter and Cyrus, the gang accidentally ran into a detective for Wells Fargo along with his hired help. George Skinner was shot and killed. Romero and Newton were arrested and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Bill Carter took the gold they hid in Folsom and turned it over in exchange for a pardon. During all of this, Cyrus and Barter had been in jail for mule theft. When they got out, They went their separate ways with nothing to show for the Wells Fargo mule heist. $40,000 in gold got handed over to the law, and the other $40,000 was buried somewhere in the Trinity Mountains of California. George Skinner was killed. He was the one who buried the gold. It seems as though nobody has been able to recover the gold, now worth millions. The next story is about buried treasure left behind by Butch Cassidy and his infamous gang of outlaws known as the Wild Bunch. Butch Cassidy and his gang frequently used a hideout now known as Robber's Roost in Utah. This area was perfect because it is a remote canyon with rough terrain. It was hard to navigate for those familiar with the area, let alone lawmen trying to chase outlaws. In 1897, Cassidy and his friend L.Z. Lay used this remote location to their advantage when they planned their latest robbery. The nearby town of Castle Gate was started in 1886 when the Pleasant Valley Coal Company began mining operations. The livelihood of the town depended upon the miners' salaries. The payroll was delivered by train at a random time every week to avoid robbery, which was a successful strategy until it wasn't. The days prior to April 21st, 1897, Butch Cassidy rode into town and mingled with the locals, eventually learning an approximate time for the train's arrival. Once the train arrived, the outlaws were ready, as the paymaster and 2 guards were exiting the train with the payroll worth about $8,000 or $300,000 adjusted for inflation. They were held up at gunpoint at the foot of the stairs to the company office by Cassidy and Lay. Cassidy had never been known to kill a man, and he wasn't about to start today. The paymaster handed over the bags of money, and the men fled by horseback to Robber's Roost. As they rode off, they cut telegraph lines so the law couldn't be called. Not that it would have mattered. Lawmen were afraid to follow them all the way to their hideout. The Wasatch Wave newspaper had this to say about the robbery, written on April 30th, 1897. With the failure of the Green River Posse to intercept the Castlegate robbers, the last hope of their capture, short of the San Rafaels, was abandoned. If they are ever to be dislodged, it will be at a great expense and sacrifice of life. Many years later, it was revealed by one of the gang members that the money was still buried near Robber's Roost in Utah. It has not yet been recovered. This next story switches outlaws once again, and this time the legends of buried treasure involve the James Younger gang in Oklahoma. Jesse James and his brother Frank are perhaps the most famous outlaws in U.S. history. The James Younger gang robbed enough banks and trains to make them multimillionaires in today's money. Because they were frequently on the run, they were undoubtedly forced to bury at least some of their riches, with the intent to go back for it once the trail was clear. There are many such stories, in fact. One noteworthy legend comes from the Keechee Hills, located in the Wichita Mountains in Comanche County, Oklahoma. It is believed that the gang stole $2 million worth of gold from a Mexican government transport in the years following the Civil War that it possibly buried in the area. In the very early 1900s, the land was being opened to settlers. Rumors of treasure being buried nearby was always a common conversation in the area. It wasn't until 1907 and after Jesse's death when Frank James, Jesse's brother and partner in crime, conveniently moved to the area. This further enhanced the legends of treasure being buried there. I can hardly blame them for thinking that, considering a member of the gang that supposedly buried the treasure suddenly buys land in the area. The locals took note that Frank seemed rather uninterested in farming on his newly acquired 100-acre farm. It's not clear if Frank James actually found any of the lost loot before he died. The newly settled land had changed a lot since the gold was buried. However, he was noted to have contacted a woman named Mrs. Belle Headland. Mrs. Headland owned land that the James gang used to camp on years prior. Frank was searching for a big flat rock that had a map carved on the bottom. Despite searching for months, Frank was never able to locate what he was looking for. He is rumored to have found $6,000 near a landmark named Buzzard's Roost. He eventually gave up when his mother died and he moved back to Missouri to live out the rest of his years there. It wasn't until the 1930s when Joe Hunter, a police officer in Rush Springs, was met by a man who identified himself simply as Cook. Cook was an old man who claimed to have helped bury the treasure with Joe Hunter's father. Cook described the area where Hunter could find a flat rock with a map carved on the bottom and gave Hunter multiple maps. Hunter was able to find the rock with the map, but wasn't making much progress locating more clues or the treasure. Years later, Hunter read an article in the local newspaper about Mrs. Headland finding another flat rock with a map carved into it. The same Mrs. Headland that Frank James had searched her property for a flat rock with a map carved into it. She finally found it. The Daily Oklahoman had this to say when Mrs. Headland made the discovery in 1932. Are the Keechee Hills of southeastern Cato County, northeast Comanche County, and southwest Grady County about to give up part of the vast store of treasure which legend insists was placed in their keeping by Frank and Jesse James and their followers? Is the treasure to be found by a widow pioneer homesteader in the area after all others, including Frank James, failed in the hunt? Hunter naturally reached out to her to see if this new map could be of any help in his search. After seeing the new map, he was able to follow the clues from the maps he had already been given to a nearby rock formation called Buzzard's Roost, the same rock formation that Frank James allegedly found $6,000. He uncovered some gold and yet another map. He gave the gold to Mrs. Headland since it was found on her property. He kept the map and searched on for more clues. The map led him 30 miles southwest to Tarbone Mountain, where in 1948, more than 15 years later, he found and uncovered a brass bucket with etchings in the side. The etchings include a contract between the outlaws in the James Younger gang saying they are to split the loot evenly, and even more clues to find the missing $2 million. Along with the brass bucket was a Dutch oven with an undisclosed amount of gold inside. Certainly not all the gold, though. The trail goes cold from here, and legends about the whereabouts of the remaining gold run rampant. Yet another case of lost outlaw loot is the Ruggles brothers' lost gold. On May 14, 1892, John and Charles Ruggles were waiting along a sharp curve in the Middle Creek Road between Redding and Shasta, California. They were waiting to rob a stagecoach with $5,000 worth of gold coins, which is worth much more today. The pair were not typical outlaws, however. Charles had a college education and they came from a well-respected family. John was known to be the problem child of the family. John was previously known to rob stagecoaches in Nevada and California with a man known as Arizona Pete. When Charles graduated college, he went looking for John, who at the time was hiding out in the Sierra Nevada mountains. John convinced his college-educated brother Charles that there were easier ways to make money. Once they found out about the Redding and Weaverville stagecoach, they eagerly awaited its arrival outside of Redding, California. They knew the stagecoach would need to slow down for a sharp curve in the road, so that's where they waited. As the stagecoach approached, it slowed down as expected. Charles emerged from the tree line with a shotgun in hand. He pointed it at the driver, John Boyce, and passenger George Sir, demanding the lockbox full of gold. The driver complied without incident. Almost immediately, a shot rang out from inside the stagecoach. Unknown to the Ruggles brothers, there was a guard known as Amos Buck Montgomery inside the stagecoach who fired his shotgun at Charles, hitting him in the chest and face with buckshot. Charles was injured and returned fire and hit the driver as he collapsed to the ground. John suddenly appeared from the trees and fired into the stagecoach, wounding the guard, Buck Montgomery. All of this commotion spooked the horses pulling the stage, and they ran down the trail towards town. The driver and passenger lived, but Montgomery died a few hours later from his injuries. John assumed his brother was dying, so John hid the gold in the nearby Middle Creek, and he ran. When the stagecoach reached town, a posse was formed and went looking for the brothers. Charles was quickly found and arrested, then brought to the Reading jail where his injuries were treated, and he lived. John fled to a family member's house in Woodland, California. This lasted for 6 weeks before the law caught up to John. When the family member heard the story, they alerted the local sheriff. John was arrested and brought to the Reading jail. He was shocked to see his brother alive and well after John left him dying on the side of the trail. In an attempt to avoid further trouble, John came up with a story that Montgomery was actually in on the robbery and his death was an accident. The locals didn't buy this story, though. John even went as far as to tell the lawmen where the loot was hidden. Whether he was telling the truth or not, I don't know. But the loot was never recovered. This is where the story gets a little wild. This is the one single consistent detail across different sources I researched. As the brothers sat in jail, many local women started taking a liking to them, even bringing them gifts like fruit and cake. Apparently, the men even received marriage offers. A trial was set for July 28th, but on July 24th, an armed mob of 40 men raided the jail. Apparently, they had enough of the outlaws hogging all the local women and decided to take matters into their own hands. The jailkeeper was outnumbered and stepped aside before the mob blew open the safe with the cell's keys. The brothers were dragged from their cells. John tried to tell the mob that he would disclose the location of the gold if they spare his brother Charles. But John's words fell on deaf ears. They were both lynched at the corner of Shasta Street in Reading. After the incident, the Los Angeles Times had this to say about the lack of law and order. The lynching of a brace of stage robbers at Reading a few nights ago was not at all in accordance with law and order, but that it will have a discouraging effect on the hold-up industry, there is little question. It will be perfectly safe to indulge in stage rides in Shasta County, no doubt, for some time to come. No one was ever prosecuted for their deaths. John was the only one who truly knew where the gold was hidden and took that secret to his grave. Switching gears a bit, instead of outlaw loot, this is a story of a lost gold mine. Perhaps not as adrenaline-filled as treasure buried by outlaws. It could be the most plausible and profitable story yet. The Lost Dutchman Gold Mine is perhaps America's most famous lost gold mine. The mine allegedly exists or existed in the Superstition Mountains east of Phoenix, Arizona. The ore was very rich with gold. During the 1840s, the Peralta family is said to have operated a highly profitable mine in the Superstition Mountains. Legend has it that in 1848, during an expedition to bring gold back to Mexico, most of the family was massacred by a group of Apache Native Americans. The Apache then buried the gold and sealed the Dutchman mine. William Edwards, one of the cavalrymen who discovered the remains, initially thought that the remains were Native Americans, but then noticed one had a gold filling, which made it apparent that these were wealthy individuals. He then later discovered more remains further up the canyon. Him and his son spent most of their lives searching for the lost mine. Years later, in the 1870s, Jacob Waltz, an aspiring gold miner, is said to have located the mine with help of a descendant of the Peralta family. He and his partner, Jacob Weiser, allegedly worked the mine and stashed gold around the Weaver's Needle landmark. Weiser would eventually be killed by Apaches. Or at least that's what Jacob Waltz said. Some believe it was him who killed Weiser. Later in life, Jacob is said to have sold $250,000 worth of gold to the U.S. Mint during the 1880s. Years later, Waltz moved to Phoenix and died in 1891. While he was on his deathbed, neighbor Julia Thomas took care of him, and he apparently told her where to find the Dutchman mine. She assembled a team and spent many years searching to no avail. In some sort of cruel twist of fate, not even a year after their search in 1892, an area they had been searching experienced a landslide which revealed rich gold ore. This new discovery resulted in very successful Black Queen and Mammoth mines being opened. Julia and her team never found any gold. Ultimately, it's unclear if there is really a hidden mine containing riches in the Superstition Mountains. Many have tried to locate the lost mine, and they've all come back empty-handed. Some have even died. There are lots of stories about people who supposedly found it, but due to strange circumstances couldn't get a land claim, or they even went missing shortly after. The legend runs deep enough that the land is now in Arizona State Park, called the Lost Dutchman State Park.